Okay, let's see here. Wire that into there, plug that into there, make sure that's in there. Oh, hey! Welcome back to another episode of Light Show Networking with Nick. Today on this episode of Light Show Networking with Nick, or Listenerin, we're going to be learning about how to connect a Raspberry Pi or a Pixel controller to your network for the first time. Now, we'll get started as soon as I can figure out why mine won't work. I know I'm an expert in everything, and I know everything about all this, so I know what I'm doing, but for some reason, I just feel like I have the Ethernet cable plugged in the wrong way. Let me just show it to you. So, if you take a look here, I have my F16V3 and I'm trying to hook up the Ethernet cable into it. I don't think there's any problems. I have the other end cut off. I have it wired into the Ethernet ports down here. And I have the USB cord plugged into the Ethernet. And then I have the main power cord for the thing. It is wired directly into the controller. I didn't know which colors to use because I forgot, but I think white and green are correct because those are Christmas colors and this is a Christmas controller, so that's got to be right. I'm just going to leave the black one like that. But it won't work for some reason. I don't know why. I've tried plugging in the Ethernet cable into my router. It won't connect. Maybe I just need a plug-in power and try that again. Hey everyone, thanks for watching How To Pixel, and in today's video, like you may have guessed from the intro, we're going to be talking about networking and continuing our series about networking and connecting all of our devices for a light show to make everything work. Now I wanted to give this series a name, and the best thing I could think of was Light Show Networking with Nick, or it's LSNWN. Listenerin, something like that, listenering. So from now on, if you see LSNWN in the title of any video, it's something to do with this networking series. Anyways, like always, if you want to skip to a certain part of the video or go back to rewatch something, please feel free to use the timestamps in the scrub bar and in the description below so you can get right to what you want to see. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, check it out right here, if you want to. In part 1, I explained the basics on networking, all of the terminology you hear in it, like IP addresses, gateways, all that good stuff. And it was more of a beginner video, so if you have no idea what networking is and you don't know anything about it, I'd recommend you check that video out first if you haven't seen it yet. But if you have seen it or you do know the basics on networking, then you can keep watching this video. Now here's what we have for today's video. So like I said in the last video, the goal of this series is to build up your knowledge on how a network works so you can reach the end goal of setting up your own light show network for your light display or a network however you want it to run your lights. Well, the first step to getting to that goal is we have to configure our devices. To configure our devices, we have to connect them to a network for the first time so we can access them. For all of this to make sense, I'm going to take a quick detour back to some basic information. Some of you may already know this, but I want to make sure everyone understands this so they're not confused in the video. These devices we want to hook up to a network like Raspberry Pis and Pixel controllers are the main things that run our light show. The Raspberry Pi is like a computer and it is the main controller of almost everything in most situations. Sometimes people use software called Xschedule on an actual computer to run their show, and that's fine, but a lot of people like to use what's called a Raspberry Pi, which is this, a whole computer within this little board, and it's a lot cheaper than a regular computer, and people will put software on here called Falcon Player, and it's free and available for everyone, and it works great to control our light show. Now, Pixel controllers like these take data from those computers, whether it be through Xschedule or through the Raspberry Pi, and these convert the data to send out to the pixels. Now, almost all the time, we run these devices in what's called headless mode. Headless mode is where there's no keyboard, no mice, no monitor connected to the devices. You basically just have the device plugged in and then plug in your controller. You can't really change or configure it because there's no user input. So we have to use a separate device to connect to this device to control it. It might sound a little confusing, but it makes it a lot easier to change the settings. If you have your light show set up and you have a Raspberry Pi in a garage, let's say, and then maybe some Pixel controllers in the yard, if you need to change something and it's the middle of winter, you have your controller out there, wouldn't it be annoying to have to cart a monitor, a keyboard, and mouse to each controller to configure? Well, that's why we run them in headless mode, because we can connect to them with a computer, a phone, any device on that same network to reach it and then configure it that way. Now, technically, every Pixel controller that I know, you don't even have the option. You have to use it in headless mode because there's no spot to plug in an HDMI cable for a monitor or a mouse or anything. With Raspberry Pis, there are options to plug in monitors and keyboard and mice, but most of the time you aren't going to use that. You're going to be using it in regular headless mode like we do when we're setting up our light show. However, the only problem with headless mode is connecting to it for the first time can be a pain. You don't really have any information about the device, such as the IP address or anything, and you can't tell it what your Wi-Fi name is so it can connect to your network. So that's the only bad part about running these devices in headless mode. And that's what this video is for. This video is going to show you how to connect your devices to a network for the first time. Once we connect to it for the first time, we can make some changes to the configuration to make it a lot easier to connect to these in the future. So first, let's get started and see how we can connect to a Raspberry Pi for the first time, and then we'll move on to the controller. Just a quick little editing note before we continue on. This video is already extremely long, almost at 30 minutes. It's probably over 30 minutes by the time I add this in, with just the Raspberry Pi. And the goal of this series was to not make super long videos. So in this video, I'm only going to talk about the Raspberry Pi and connecting to it for the first time. And in the next episode, I'll talk about connecting to a Pixel controller for the first time. So there's that little note just to clear up confusion, but now back to the video. So I have my Raspberry Pi right here. It is in a protective case, has a little fan on it. This is the Raspberry Pi 4 with 2 GB of RAM. Falcon Player will run on any size Raspberry Pi, whether you have 1 GB of RAM or 8 GB. If you don't know how to use Falcon Player, or you've never heard of the software that we have on these Raspberry Pis when we connect them, I recommend you check out this video first, because there's a lot of good information about it, and I explain how Falcon Player works. But anyway, I have this SD card right here. It is a 32 GB SD card. It has Falcon Player version 7.5 on it, and I'm going to be booting this Pi up for the first time with that. So no settings have been changed, nothing has been done to the Pi, and I'm going to show you the different ways you can connect to it. So there are 2 different ways that you can get this to connect to your network that I'm going to show in this video. There are some other ways, but a lot of them are more complicated. The first one is the way most people do it, and it's by taking an Ethernet cable, plugging it into the Raspberry Pi, and then plugging the other end into your router. That way, this automatically talks with your router, and then your router allows it to connect to the network. You don't have to put in any passwords or anything, because it's right through Ethernet, so it's easy to get this connected when it's in headless mode, and there's no monitor or keyboard or anything. Now, the second way you can connect to this for the first time is a way I don't hear a lot of people talk about, and I feel like it should be talked about more, because it might honestly be a little bit easier than using Ethernet, but it depends on the situation. The second way is by using the hotspot that is built in to the Raspberry Pi that Falcon Player takes advantage of. I'll talk about how to use that in a second, but first I'm going to talk about how you connect to it with Ethernet. So it's really simple. Just make sure you have the SD card with the software in there. You want to plug in the Ethernet cable, and then the other end of the Ethernet cable, like I said, needs to plug into your router. Now, for some people, this can be a problem, because I know it can be hard to plug an Ethernet cable into your router. Your router might be somewhere else in your house that you can't reach to with the Raspberry Pi. It doesn't matter, though, where the Raspberry Pi is in the house. It could be next to your router if you want to, and you could still connect to it as long as it's plugged in. But if you cannot plug your Raspberry Pi into your router with an Ethernet cable, then I recommend using the second method with the Wi-Fi hotspot. My router is actually in my living room, and it's not near here, but thankfully, I have this Ethernet port right here below my green screen that I use in the videos, even though my wall is already green. This Ethernet port right here, my dad and I put it in 2 years ago or something. That way, I didn't have to go out and plug it into the router and then have the Raspberry Pi out there. So this actually has an Ethernet cable behind it that goes through the wall into the attic, and then down the wall to the living room, and then there's another Ethernet jack right there, and that plugs into the router. So this is a direct connection to the router. Now this black cable, I'm going to unplug. That just goes to my computer, and I'm going to plug in the Ethernet cable that goes to the Raspberry Pi. So there we go. There's now an Ethernet connection from my Raspberry Pi to my router. So now that this has an Ethernet cable to it, it has the software in it, you don't have to hook anything else up to the Raspberry Pi. You could just give it power, and I'm going to plug in the Raspberry Pi power supply, and there we go. The fan is on. And if this has a connection, the light should turn on. You'll see we have an orange light and a green light. They just turned off, but it does that when it's booting up. It turns on and off a few times. What you want to see, hopefully, is this green light. This should be blinking, and that means this is communicating with whatever device is on the other side. So since it's blinking and the router's on the other side of this Ethernet cable, that means it's communicating, and that means it's now hooked up to our network. Now that the Raspberry Pi is hooked up to our network, we can connect to it. Now you might be wondering, how do you connect to it with another device, and what devices can I use? You can use technically any device that has a web browser on it, as long as it's connected to the same network as the Raspberry Pi. So you could use your cell phone, your tablet, your computer. I suppose if your fridge had a web browser on it, you could use that too. As long as they are on the same network as the Raspberry Pi. As long as everything's connected to the same router. So for me, in all of these examples, I'm going to be using my computer because having a bigger screen is easier. Smaller devices can be a little bit harder. I know with Falcon Player, they've updated the software a lot to make it more mobile friendly. But when you're connecting to a Pixel controller, sometimes it's really hard to see all the settings because it's a very small screen. But as long as the device is on the same network as the Raspberry Pi, you can connect to it if it has a web browser. Now, how do you connect to the Raspberry Pi or the Pixel controller when that time comes? Well, all you have to do is on the device with the web browser, you just have to type in the IP address of the device, and then the web browser opens up the web interface, or sometimes called the user interface, of the Raspberry Pi, and that's where we adjust all of the settings. Now, the only hard part about this is finding the IP address. First, we have to find what the IP address of the Raspberry Pi is, so we can type it in to connect to it. If you remember last video when I was talking about DHCP, and whenever a device connects to your router, DHCP gives it an IP address. Well, when we powered up that Raspberry Pi, it sent a message to the router saying, hey, can I get an IP address? The DHCP server answered and it said, sure, here's your IP address. But we have no idea what the DHCP server gave to it as an IP address, and we can't just open up the screen of the Raspberry Pi and look at what it is because we don't have any of that connected. So we're going to have to go to our router and our router's web interface to see what it gave it. This might seem a little complicated, but I'm going to try and walk through it the best I can. So let's go take a look at my computer to see how we can do that. Now, I hate to be the guy that stops the video halfway through, but I want to take a quick second to tell you about today's sponsor of the video, PCBWay. Our good friends at PCBWay wanted to sponsor another video, so if you haven't heard of them before, listen to this. PCBWay makes custom circuit boards, and they have whatever you need to bring your electronics project to life. Whether you need just a few PCBs or a lot of PCBs, they can help you with your project no matter the size. With their great customer service, fast shipping times, and so many customization options you could choose for your PCB, it's no wonder why they're such a popular PCB seller. You could choose to have your circuit board assembled by them with all the components on it. That way you don't have to do any work. Or if you're into that, you could just get the plain PCB board and then get all the components and solder them on yourself. Like I said, they have so many different customization options. Just look at this page and how many options there are on here. So if you're looking for a great place to get your PCBs from, then check out PCBWay at www.pcbway.com. Now back to where we left off in the video. So to connect to your router, it's the same idea as connecting to the Raspberry Pi. All you have to do is type in the IP address of it into any web browser on a device that's on the same network. But how do we find the IP address of the router to go onto the router to find the IP address of the Raspberry Pi? Well, since this device is connected on the same network, we can actually use the command line on our computer to help us. So to go to the command prompt, you can go to search on your computer, and if you type in CMD, it will show command prompt and click open. Once this is open, you want to type in the command ipconfig. It looks like this, it's just ipconfig, and I'll make it bigger so everyone can see it. ipconfig, and then if you push enter, it's going to give you a whole lot of information right here. A lot of this is going to be blurred because it's private information, but the thing you want to look for when all of this pops up is the default gateway. Remember in the last video, I talked about the gateway is your router and it's what routes all of your traffic. So if you look for the default gateway, it's basically telling you the router's IP address and where it's going. So if we look under default gateway, you can ignore the big number, but if you look at the IP address, this is the IP address of our router, and it's 192.168.1.1. Yours may be different, or yours may be the same as mine, but that's how you find your router's IP address on Windows. On Mac, it's the same thing. You want to open the command line on Mac, and then the command to see all this information on Mac, I'll put on the screen now. But anyway, now that we know our router's IP address, we could type that in. And when you type that into your browser, it will open up your router's web interface. So here you go, you can see mine is loading in. Now, everyone's router is going to look different because different models have different web interfaces. So just try and follow along as best you can because the settings and names might be slightly different. First, you have to type in the password to access your router. So I'm going to type in mine right here. And then when you click enter or sign in or whatever the button is, it will open up the main interface and show you everything inside. So here's all of the settings for my router. I can go to the different menus and change a whole bunch of settings. But when you're on here, the main thing you want to look for is the device list right here. Or at least on my router, it's right here. For you, it may be down on the menu or it might be in a different spot. But look for something that shows all of the devices connected. And if you click that, on mine, it shows all the devices I have connected. So once you see all of the devices, you want to look for a device that says Raspberry Pi or FPP or something like that. And if we scroll down right here, you could see it says FPP right here. This is showing the Raspberry Pi connected to the router. If you click for extra information, it will open and it will show you the IP address it's connected with on your network. Now, don't get confused by my page. It shows a whole bunch of different things because I've had 3 Raspberry Pis connected at the same time. So it's going to show some other information, but it shows all of those are offline. I only have 1 Raspberry Pi online right now, and it shows the IP address right here. So this is the IP address the DHCP server gave it. It was 192.168.1.102. So what you're going to want to do is copy that so you don't forget it, write it down, do something with it. And now we know where we can go to access the Raspberry Pi. So now if we type in that IP address, 192.168.1.102, and we push enter, hey, look it opens up the web interface of the Raspberry Pi. So our computer right now is connected to the Raspberry Pi, and the Raspberry Pi is showing us this web interface. So all of the things we type in, all of the settings we change, our computer is sending all the messages to our router. The router is then sending it to the Raspberry Pi, and then the Raspberry Pi knows what we're changing. Now, once you're on here, something you want to do is set what's called a static IP address. I'll get to that in a second, but first I'm going to go through and finish the initial setup it wants me to do. I'm not going to show how to set this up now because I've shown it in my Falcon Player tutorial, so if you want more information about that, go check that out. Okay, so I just finished the initial setup, and now it's asking me to expand the SD card like it always does when you first boot it up. I'm going to skip that for now, and I will do it after I set up the network. So let's go to the network tab so I can show you what a static IP address is. If you go under the status control tab, the network is the second page down, and if you click that, it brings up all of the network settings. A static IP address basically means setting your own IP address or setting up the IP address manually, not letting DHCP do it. If we use a static IP address, the Raspberry Pi, instead of asking the router for an IP address, it'll be like, hey router, I'm going to connect with this IP address whether you like it or not, and I don't want DHCP's help. Since the IP address will never change, we will always know what it is, and that way every time we want to connect to the Raspberry Pi, we don't have to go onto the router and look through all the details. We could just type in that one IP address because it will never change. So here on the network page, there are 3 different tabs. The third one is the tethering tab. This is where the hotspot is set up. This is where you just change some information about the hotspot, but I'm not going to talk about the settings now. The host and DNS settings are also some other settings we don't really need to worry about now. These will be in future videos. The interface settings is where we set up the Ethernet and Wi-Fi interface. Raspberry Pis are kind of cool because they have 2 different ways they can connect to your router. They can connect with Wi-Fi and with Ethernet, and you can use both at the same time. Right now, our Raspberry Pi is only connected with Ethernet with our Ethernet cable, and no Wi-Fi is hooked up yet. You can look up here in the corner, and you can see that it shows Ethernet, but there's no Wi-Fi up here. It's only connected with Ethernet with this address. So first, let's hook up the Wi-Fi interface and set that with a static IP address so we can access it through Wi-Fi with an IP address that won't change. The top 2 settings you don't want to worry about. It's only these settings down here. The interface name, these are the 2 different interfaces we can change. Like I talked about in the last video, ETH0 means the Ethernet interface and WLAN 0 means the Wi-Fi interface. So if we click WLAN, we're changing the Wi-Fi settings. If we click ETH0, we're changing the Ethernet settings. So first, let's do the WLAN 0. First, what you want to do is come to these new settings that pop up, the wireless settings. The first one is asking for the WPA SSID. This is just basically asking for the network name you want to connect to with Wi-Fi. If you click it, it should show some Wi-Fi names that are detected by the Raspberry Pi, and you could select the one you want to use. After you put that in, it's going to ask for the pre-shared key or PSK. Basically, it's asking for the password with a bunch of fancy words. So just type in the password of your Wi-Fi name, and I will do that now. And now it has the information to connect with Wi-Fi to your network. Before we hit go with this though, right now the interface mode is set for DHCP. We don't want this because it's going to ask the router, hey, I'd like to connect with Wi-Fi. Can you give me an IP address? We want to be stern and have a static IP address and say, no, I'm not letting you boss me around, router. I'm telling you I want this IP address. So now you might be thinking, but what IP address do we give it? This IP address has to be different than the Ethernet IP address since they're two separate interfaces. And something we could do to figure out the IP address we want to use is we can go back to the router and check what IP addresses are in use, and we could select one that isn't in use. Now, something you need to remember, if you've seen last video, you already know this, all of your devices on your network have to have the first 3 octets be the same of the IP address. The 4th octet is the host octet, and that's the one we change. That's the unique identifying number for each device. If this sounds like a bunch of words you've never heard of before, I recommend checking out the last video so you understand this a little bit more. So we already know, since the Ethernet connected with 192.168.1 first, the IP address is going to begin with those 3 octets. All we need to do is just figure out what we want the host number to be. And once we've gone through our devices and found one that isn't in use, we can use that one. Something I'd recommend is using one that's within the higher range. The host number can be anything from 2 to 254, and using something that's in the 200 range usually is better to use because DHCP normally in most situations doesn't give out those IP addresses. So for me, one that I always use for my Raspberry Pis is 226. Now you notice when we type this in, the Raspberry Pi already fills out the net mask and the gateway. That's because it already knows what to put in. Well, the gateway isn't full yet, but I'll tell you what that has to be in a second. First, the net mask is always going to be this number right here, 255.255.255.0. And then the gateway, when a device asks for the gateway, all it's asking for is the router's IP address, so it knows where to send all the traffic to have it be routed. We already know, since we found our router's IP address, it's 192.168.1.1. Now, if trying to find an IP address that isn't in use is too hard for you, something you can do is connect the device with DHCP and then see what IP address the router gives it. Once you found out what IP address the router gives it, you can just set that one as a static IP address if you like, but I like to set my own, that way I can remember the number. So once we've set up all of this, we can hit the update interface button, and it will say, don't forget to check your DNS and set that up. We'll talk more about this in another video. We can just close this warning for now, and then we're going to want to hit restart network. And it'll say, warning, applying these changes could cause you to lose connection. Do you want to continue? And hit yes. So now if we refresh the page, we're still connected because we're using the Ethernet IP address we didn't change. But if we look over here, you can see it's now connected with Wi-Fi and it has the IP address we gave it manually. So if we open another tab, we could type in that IP address we gave it, which for me was 192.168.1.226. And if we push enter, hey, that also connects us to the Falcon player. So by using this IP address, the one that ends in 102, we're connecting to the Raspberry Pi through the Ethernet cable. When we use this IP address, since this is the Wi-Fi one, we're connecting to the Raspberry Pi through the Wi-Fi chip. So now this IP address will never change because we set it to be static. So we can write this down and this will forever be the IP address of the Raspberry Pi as long as you don't change it. Now the Ethernet IP address could change since we haven't set it to static yet. So if we want to do that, you can click the Ethernet interface and click static and then put in the IP address, netmask, and gateway. You'll notice it doesn't ask for a Wi-Fi name or network, and that's because it's using Ethernet. But now in the future, we could change these settings when we make our own Wi-Fi network, but we know where to go to make those changes because this IP address will never change. And since we are connected with Wi-Fi, we can now unplug the Ethernet cable if you're not going to leave it in, and the Raspberry Pi will still work and we can still connect to it through Wi-Fi. So if I go and unplug the Ethernet cable like I just did, hey, you'll look at Ethernet went away, but if we refresh this page, we still have connection. If we refresh the other page that uses the Ethernet IP address, it's just loading, it's not opening. And in a second, it will show, hey, we can't connect. And there it is. It says we cannot reach this site. That's because since Ethernet is not connected anymore, this IP address no longer works. So that's how you can connect to the Raspberry Pi for the first time with Ethernet. Now I'm going to show you how to do it with the Wi-Fi hotspot. So I've just gone and restored the default settings, so it's like this Raspberry Pi has never been booted on. And now let's say you want to connect to this, you're ready to hook it up to your network, but you can't use Ethernet, or you even don't want to. You could still use this even if you do have access to Ethernet, you just don't want to use it. Doing it this way, in my opinion, is honestly slightly easier because you don't have to go and look for the IP address when we get ready to do this. The only problem is sometimes it doesn't work, but I've never had that problem happen to me. I've just heard of it being a problem. Another good thing about setting it up this way is if you have a light show, let's say it's in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a forest for some reason, and you don't have a network to connect it to, you can have the Raspberry Pi make the network, and every device can connect to that to control the Raspberry Pi. However, the only problem by using it this way is the Raspberry Pi won't have any internet connection. So all the devices connected to it and the Raspberry Pi itself cannot reach the internet, but they can at least communicate with each other. So the way this works is a Raspberry Pi has a Wi-Fi chip in it right around this area, and that's how it connects to the router. The Wi-Fi chip can also make its own Wi-Fi network, often called a Wi-Fi hotspot. We can then connect to that Wi-Fi network to connect to the Raspberry Pi. And then once we do that, we can go on there and tell it our Wi-Fi name so we can turn off the hotspot and connect to Wi-Fi that way. So you might be thinking, how do I do this? I just put the SD card in, now what do? Well, you literally just power it up and wait. You don't have to do anything to it. The way it works is the Raspberry Pi will automatically look for an Ethernet connection and look for a Wi-Fi connection, and if it doesn't detect either, it'll be like, I don't have a connection. I'm going to turn on my Wi-Fi hotspot. Sometimes you just have to wait a few minutes though, so that's what we're going to do. And another thing is, if you do have a connection with either Ethernet or Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi hotspot will be shut off. So you want to make sure that you haven't made any changes to it, or you don't have Ethernet plugged into it, which you probably don't. And that's how you get the hotspot to be enabled. But now let's hop over to the computer to see how we can connect to this. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to your computer's internet settings, where you tell it what Wi-Fi networks to connect to. I'm going to go down here to my little settings and click on Wi-Fi. And you can see right now I'm connected to our home network and I have internet access and all that stuff. But now if you look through the names of Wi-Fi networks, you'll see this one called FPP, which if you look at your Wi-Fi networks in the area, you'll know that this normally isn't there. Well, that's the Raspberry Pi activating its hotspot because it didn't detect any connection. So there's now a Wi-Fi network called FPP that you can connect to. So you're going to want to connect to that network, and usually it's going to ask you for a password. But for me, I've already connected to it before, so it doesn't. The password to connect to it is a super secret, unguessable password, and it's Christmas. I don't remember if it's a capital C or what it is, so I'll put it on the screen right now. This is the password you use to connect to the Wi-Fi network. Now, once you're on the Wi-Fi network, you'll notice you could try and search something, but nothing will come up. It will show that you have no internet access. But we can connect to the Raspberry Pi. And since we're using the Raspberry Pi's hotspot, we already know what the IP address is going to be because it's always the same on the hotspot. The IP address you're going to want to type in to access the Raspberry Pi is 192.168.8.1. This is the IP address right here, and if you push enter, look at that. We are connected to the Raspberry Pi. You'll notice up here, when we were connected to it last time, it showed an Ethernet logo or a Wi-Fi logo, but now it shows this little radio tower logo. That means that this Raspberry Pi is in Wi-Fi hotspot mode. So if you're in the middle of nowhere, you could just stay connected to this, and you can make all of your changes to the Raspberry Pi now. However, if you're connecting to this just temporarily because you want to go to the Wi-Fi settings now to connect it to your actual home network, you can do that. So we can go over to the network settings. Now, obviously, we cannot connect anything with Ethernet because even if we put in an IP address, it doesn't matter. There's no Ethernet cable plugged in. But we can go to the Wi-Fi network, and we can do the same thing we did last time. We can put in the SSID of our Wi-Fi network, we can put in the password, and then you can use DHCP if you want and connect it that way and then see what IP address it gives you. But I recommend setting that to static so it doesn't change. Or you could just set a static IP address now if you already know a number that's not being used. So I will do that, and I will do the 266, or the, not 266, 226 like I did last time. Now we can hit update interface, and it's going to tell us about the DNS again. We don't have to worry about that. And then hit restart. It's going to say, warning, you could lose connection, and we're going to hit yes. Now, if we try to go back and type in that IP address again, the 192.168.8.1 to connect to the Raspberry Pi, it's not going to work, and that's because the hotspot has now been shut off. My computer connected me back to my old network because FPP is no longer here. It doesn't show up. That's because the Raspberry Pi has turned it off. So if you are connected to the same network that you connected the Raspberry Pi to, you could type in the IP address that you set it to. We set it to 192.168.1.226. If we push enter, there we go. We are connected. This is connected with a static IP address, so it's not going to change, and we can always use this address to connect to it now. If you use DHCP and let the router determine it, you would have to go on your router to see what IP address it gave it, and then you could set it manually after that. You finally made it through another episode of Light Show Networking with Nick. So hopefully at this point, you now understand how you can connect all of your devices to your network for the first time so you can access them, change settings in the future, and one day you can reconfigure the network settings for your own Light Show network when we get there. Like every video on this channel, I know there was a ton of information within this video, so if you have any questions or comments, or you're having trouble setting up something and you can't get it to work, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below, and I'll try to respond as soon as I can, and I'll try and help out and answer any questions you have. If there's anything network related you want to see in this series, and it has to do with light shows, please feel free to let me know in the comments something you want to know how to do, and maybe at some point in the series I'll make a video about it. But I think that's going to conclude it for this video. Now I am quite parched from all the talking I've done, so I'm going to go get a drink of water. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.